Prologue, 11 years ago. Otto Hocking awoke to a blinding headache and complete darkness. His body was bouncing up and down, and his head hit on a spot so sore it couldn't have been the first time. Where was he? There was the harsh whine of a chainsaw. No, a snowmobile. He tried to sit up, but his arms and legs were slow to respond and could only move inches. He was trapped in something soft. A blanket? And were straps holding him down? He blinked his eyes and shook his head. His brain was foggy. He was tied up like cargo, and someone was moving him on a snowmobile. Where? More importantly, why? He took stock. I'm Otto Hocking. I'm in Big Sky, Montana? No, I'd left there. I was driving. His head spun, and he gasped for breath. He laughed, then stopped suddenly. That was weird. Where was he? Yes. He'd stopped for a night in West Yellowstone, Montana. He was going home to Oklahoma. But why? He liked his life in Big Sky. He had good work, and he'd found a good woman. Why would he be going back to Oklahoma and the wife who married him instead of the man she really loved? Hell no, he wouldn't go back to her. Going back made no sense. He shivered. He was cold, even wrapped in a blanket. Maybe he should just sleep a while. The idea sounded wonderful. Ow! He awoke again, and his head bounced on that same painful spot. He tried to roll over, but his body was strangely limp and slow to obey him. He struggled. His hands and feet were tied together, not with flex ties. Nothing was cutting into his body. Something wider, something that wouldn't leave marks. Think! What was going on? He gasped again for breath, as if he'd been running for miles. Was someone taking him to a doctor? It was a funny way to go to the doctor. He started to laugh. No. He forced his mouth to stop smiling. His wrists and ankles were bound. How could he have forgotten that? What was wrong with him? He was in deep trouble. No shit, Sherlock, he said, laughing again. Suddenly the snowmobile started climbing, and he was slammed back against something metal. His nose hit hard, and he saw stars. Gosh, they were pretty. Red stars mixed in with the white ones. He bounced more as the terrain got rougher. The chainsaw whine was even louder. Then it shut off. They were still. The world was silent. Not a sound anywhere. Otto bounced as the driver got off the machine. His head jerked when someone grabbed the cloth around it, and suddenly he could see. The white lights of the snowmobile nearly blinded him, so he turned away. He was fastened to the floor, up against 3 seats that sat behind the driver's seat. It was night, and snowflakes fell on his face, leaving wet spots so cold they burned. He smiled. My God, it was gorgeous. Suddenly a man's face popped into his view, hanging over him. You, Otto said, a wave of tension flooding him. You. The man released one of the clasps and jerked Otto to a sitting position. Then he released the bindings over his legs. Otto struggled, but the blanket, it was a blanket, still held him. The man grabbed him and jerked him off the snowmobile, letting him drop onto the snow-covered ground. Otto struggled and kicked, his heart racing, his lungs gulping for more air. His heart pounded with fear, and he was angry. Finally, he escaped the blanket. What's wrong with you? He asked, managing to sit up. A wave of nausea hit him, and he spewed vomit onto the man. He rolled away and vomited again. He looked up and saw the look on the man's face, which made him laugh. The man grimaced in hatred, and he stepped toward Otto. He raised his boot, aiming his kick, but he jerked to a stop. "Damn it," the man said, his entire body shaking with the need to kick Otto. "It's bad enough I have to waste 4 cold hours out here to dump you, but now this?" Otto looked up at him. He was afraid he knew the answer, but he asked anyway. "Why didn't you kick me?" "Can't leave any marks," the man said. Just as Otto feared. "I wasn't going to do anything about what I heard. This is unnecessary. I got my orders." The man grabbed the blanket from the ground and stowed it back on the snowmobile. Then he reached inside his jacket and removed a syringe. "I've been drugged," Otto realized. "Of course. No wonder I can't think straight." And now the man would finish the job. Unless Otto had just one chance. Maybe. He sat back in the snow and held his stomach, groaning, trying to look more helpless. The man came towards him, and Otto raised his tied hands and grabbed the man's arm. He'd always had a very strong grip, but tonight his arms felt like noodles. He tried to hold on, but the man easily pushed him off, shoved him back in the snow, and jabbed the needle into his neck. He pulled out a knife and cut away the bindings on Otto's hands and legs, putting the cloth remnants into one of his pockets. Then he patted Otto down and removed his cell phone, which he laid on a snow-covered rock and smashed with his boot. He climbed back on the snowmobile. Otto took stock. He had a leather jacket, no gloves, nothing for his head, and cowboy boots. They had some tread on them. He wouldn't slip and slide on the ice, but they wouldn't keep out the water for very long. "Hawking?" the man said. Otto looked up. "You're 8 miles inside Yellowstone, past an entrance that is closed for the winter. There's nobody anywhere around and nobody coming. You can waste your last minutes trying to walk out if you want. Up to you." The man turned the sled and headed away, darkness returning as his lights dimmed and then disappeared. The whine of the snowmobile lasted a little longer, then faded away, leaving a smothering silence. Otto imagined he could feel the drug moving through his body, dimming the lights in his brain, turning down the energy in each muscle, one by one, draining him. He considered building a snow cave, but his body was wet. He'd sweated in fear, and his wet body would kill him quickly, snow cave or not. He rose to his feet. He'd walked 8 miles before. He'd walked 50. He could do it again. But his knees trembled, and his legs collapsed beneath him. He had no paper or pen he could write with, no way to tell anyone what had happened to him. He'd always dictated ideas to his phone. He crawled to the rock where the pieces of it lay. He could see the phone had sent its last message. So, he thought, this was it. What the hell does a man do when facing his death? If he was a Pawnee or Apache, or most of the Plains tribes, he'd sing a death song. But Otto was Lupiti. They didn't have death songs. At least, not as far as he knew. Then, soft, far away, Otto heard a howl. One of the Yellowstone wolves. A second wolf joined in. Then another. Now there was a chorus of howls. How did they do that? Each wolf's song was separate, a wolf's own choice of pitch, length, and movement up and down the scale. and yet they meshed into a single melody, almost a group prayer, or celebration, or a belonging ceremony. The wolf was Otto's spirit animal. He chose it, or it chose him, when he was just a boy. But he hadn't thought about it in a long time. After all, what practical value did a spirit animal have in today's world? And yet, there they were, almost like they were sending him off to the next world. Otto smiled. Then he laughed. It had to be the drug. Otto wondered what he'd been given. He'd been stupidly happy since he woke up tonight. Well, if you had to die, stupidly happy was better than most of the alternatives. Otto shook his head. He couldn't die. If he did, the man he'd overheard would get away with murder. He'd lied to the man. He'd left a letter with an attorney to send if he died. He was glad of that now. But would it get Lydia in trouble? He needed to protect her. How? He couldn't have more than minutes left to live. Already he could feel the tiredness creeping up on him. His body was urging him to give up and drift off to a wonderful sleep. "Dakota," he cried. "Dakota, my cherished daughter." He'd left her with his wife. Emily was a good woman and a good mother. She might have been a good wife to the man she really loved. All his life, he'd never felt he could please her. He'd believed he wasn't good enough, only to find out he never could have pleased her. He hadn't been able to look at her after that. But he'd planned to come back for Dakota once she was 18, to let her know she was always in his heart. She was only 7 now. Otto noticed the wolf chorus had stopped. He was so sleepy. Surprisingly, he was no longer cold. He sat up on his knees so he could stay awake as long as possible. He spread his hands out and looked up into the stars. Otto prayed to the Great Spirit. He didn't know how. He'd never done it before. He asked his spirit animal, the wolves, to intercede for him, to look out for his little girl, to let her know of his love. Otto prayed until the drugs pulled him into sleep, and he fell over. 10 minutes later, the spirits took him away.